Here we go. Chapter 1, A Brief History of Microbiology. Let's begin by asking, what is microbiology? And the answer is in the roots of the word. So looking here, I've given you some notes, and you see that oji is referred to as the study of or knowledge of, and in this case, it's the study of microscopic life, or life that's too small to be seen with the naked eye. In other words, a microscope is needed. What this implies is that before the invention of the microscope, the field of microbiology did not exist, and in fact, people had no idea that we were surrounded by these invisible microorganisms and covered with these invisible microorganisms. It wasn't until this individual came along, named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who began making very effective microscopes. Now, other people were making microscopes at this time, but his were just spectacular. His lenses were crafted better than other people's, and this allowed him to see microorganisms or life that was smaller than other people were seeing, and this led to him observing the first bacteria and other microorganisms. Now, there is a link here that I highly recommend watching. It's a fun little video that tells his story, and it's very creatively done and informative, so I definitely recommend watching that. Here's a link here to it. There's also links to these videos on the lecture portion of the D at 2L page that you can explore and should explore. But these are pictures of some of what he observed in pond water and other samples that he was looking at. And of course, this was new to everyone. No one had any idea that these little microbes existed. And he called them animalcules, or that's the English translation. But it's kind of a play on the word molecules, right? These very small little things. They included some tiny animals, also fungi, algae, and protozoa, which are these single-celled protists, as well as some bacteria, and some of these were likely bacteria that he was observing. Now, basically he saw representative samples of all the different categories of microorganisms that we know of. And these included bacteria, possibly archaea. He might not have seen these. We'll talk more about those in a bit. Also fungi, protozoans, algae, and some small multicellular animals. Let's go through these basic categories of these organisms so you can learn a little bit about them in this overview to the course. Beginning with bacteria. We'll be talking about bacteria for most of this course, and I'm sure you've heard of them. They're very small, single-celled prokaryotic organisms, meaning they don't have a nucleus, and in fact they don't have any internal organelles. They're very simple, single-celled organisms. They reproduce via asexual reproduction, the process such as binary fission that we'll talk about. And they have cell walls made out of peptidoglycan. We'll talk about that extensively as well. Now, you've probably heard a lot about bacteria in the context of them causing horrible diseases such as tuberculosis and other diseases, but in fact, it's only a small percentage of bacteria that are capable of causing diseases in animals. Of course, they get all our attention, or most of our attention, because it's very important to us, but keep in mind, that's only a small fraction. Only a small fraction of bacteria are actually pathogenic. You've maybe done this experiment in 112 where you scrape off some cheek cells and you can see our typical eukaryotic cells with the nucleus in the middle, but you can also see on here these little tiny blue dots, and these are actually the bacteria. Of course, our mouth is loaded with bacteria, and you can observe them by doing this simple wet mount stain. Another type of single-celled prokaryotic organism are these archaea, and these constitute the second of the three domains. They are superficially similar to bacteria. If you look at them under a microscope, you might not be able to tell them apart, but chemically they're very different. Now, they do undergo asexual reproduction, so they don't have the means of sexual reproduction. In that way, they're very simple and similar to bacteria. They do have cell walls, but they're composed of something different than peptidoglycan. Their name, archaea, might make you think of archaeology or archaic, both of which imply they're very old. Now, the reason that they were named that is because they were discovered in very extreme environments. The first discovery of archaea was in the 70s, I believe, and it was from Yellowstone hot springs. These pools of bubbling toxic water is where they were first discovered. So they thought maybe these are the primordial organisms that were present on early Earth. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's where that name archaea comes from. And there's none of these are known to cause disease for the most part. And for that reason, you don't hear about them as much as you do bacteria. And likewise, in this course, we'll be emphasizing the medical aspects of microbiology, so we won't be talking about archaea nearly as much as we're talking about some of these other domains. Fungi. All right, you hear fungi, you're probably thinking mushrooms. However, we're going to be focusing on microscopic fungi, the very small ones, some of which are able to make you sick, cause disease, and we'll study those a little bit. But fungi are eukaryotic organisms like us, and although superficially they might look something like plants, they are definitely not plants. They do not perform photosynthesis, and they actually obtain food by eating or consuming other organisms, sort of similar to us. And we'll talk much more about that later. There's two forms of fungi that we're going to be discussing, molds and yeasts. Mold are multicellular fungi that grow as long filaments. This is called mycelial growth. And this is what you might see on an old loaf of bread you have in the back of your fridge or left out too long or something like that. Now, there's also single-celled fungi called yeasts. And in this case, these are microscopic. You need a microscope to see them. And some notable examples are Candida albicans, which causes yeast infections, and baker's yeast or brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is used for baking and brewing, respectively. As most life does, these do possess cell walls, and their cell walls are made out of chitin. They have complicated sexual and asexual reproductive strategies, which we're not going to go into too much detail, but they are capable of both. And as I said, some cause disease, for example, yeast infections. The next group I want to talk about is called protozoans. And when you see this word, whoops. Zoa, like zoology, is referring to animals. And proto would be prototype or perhaps. I always think prototype. So in this case, I think proto-animals. And these are like animals, like true animals. These are eukaryotic organisms, but they're single-celled, not multicellular like us. And you can see some examples that you maybe seen before, amoeba or some type of ciliate or a flagellate here. And as with animals, they do not have cell walls. Now, hopefully you remember a cell wall is a distinct structure from a cell membrane. So, of course, they have cell membranes, they're cells, but they do not have a cell wall surrounding them. They're reproduced by a variety of means, mostly asexual. Some have sexual means of reproduction, and most are motile, either via pseudopods, like you see here in the amoeba, or via cilia, these short little hair-like projections, or the longer hair-like projections called flagella. Some of these cause disease. many notable examples, actually. For instance, malaria is one of the most common and deadly diseases in the world, caused by a protozoan parasite. Algae is another type of protist. Those protozoans are considered protists, as are algae. As with protozoans and other protists, they are eukaryotic. They have true organelles. In this case, they can be single-celled, as you see with these diatoms, or they might form some sort of multicellular structures or colonial structures that you sometimes see. Now, algae are photosynthetic, so these are sort of the precursors to plants. As protozoans were sort of the proto-animals, these are sort of the proto-plants. And as you can see, they can have beautiful patterns. These are derived from their cell walls. So these actually do have cell walls. In the case of the diatoms here, their cell walls are made out of silica or glass. They're really beautiful to look at under a microscope. And in this case, you can see the green of the chlorophyll for photosynthesis. And these would have cell walls made out of cellulose, similar to plants. Now, some algae do cause disease. And for example, maybe you've experienced red tide and fish kills. And those would be examples of algae that act as animal pathogens. You also sometimes you hear about algae in the context of multicellular organisms such as seaweed. Here's some red algae and some brown algae or kelp or green algae. And animals would be the last of the groups of life we're going to talk about. And of course, animals are eukaryotic and they are strictly multicellular. So for this in the picture here, you see a little roundworm, a little parasitic worm in some poor unfortunate individual's bloodstream. Animals, as I said, they don't have cell walls and they do eat, of course, so they're using organic chemicals for energy. And of course, some animals cause disease. In particular, parasitic worms, things like roundworms and tapeworms and pinworms. And we'll talk about those in lab towards the end of the course. So that sums up the groups of life that you might see that we'll be discussing in microbiology. There is one more group that I don't include there because generally they're not considered to be living. They're considered acellular. And these are, of course, viruses. They're considered non-living by most biologists for a number of reasons. One, they don't have the typical cellular structure of a cell membrane and a nucleus and all the ribosomes and that kind of business. And so sometimes what they're called are submicroscopic particles. Because they're very small, you need specialized microscopes, such as electron microscopes, as you see here, to be able to visualize them. Very, very tiny. And all they are is a little bit of nucleic acid, either DNA or RNA, depending on the virus, enclosed within a protein coat. And what they do is they enter into a host's cells. For example, an animal might be infected with a virus, and the virus hijacks the machinery of the cell and uses the cellular ribosomes and polymerases and other tools to make more viruses. So that hijacked cell becomes a virus factory. And this, of course, propagates the infection, and that's the replication strategy of viruses, in that they can only multiply within a host cell. Okay, so that concludes the overview of microbial life. If you look in the exercise folder on D2L, you'll see a little concept map in Chapter 1 that will help walk you through these different categories of life. So go ahead and complete that exercise sheet, that concept map, and read the chapter and try to learn all this. Okay, talk to you again soon.